Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Mahadio Sukai. I am the Vice President, Research and International Affairs and the Chief Accessibility Officer for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, or CNIB. I am also the External Co-Chair for the CIHR External Advisory Committee on Accessibility and Systemic Ableism, and that is the extent of my biography that I'm going to give you this morning. I'm very pleased to be here with you today for this last session of the EDI Symposium, or as it probably should better be titled, the IDEA Symposium, IDEA, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility. With me today are three esteemed panelists in person and one esteemed panelist virtually, and I will introduce you from my immediate left, working my way over and then virtual, to Dr. Bonnie Sweener, Anna Sophia Barrows, and Ainsley Latour, who is up for the second time this morning. And virtually, I would introduce you to Andy Livingston. Anna Sophia, Ainsley, and Andy are members of my team and have worked on the project that we're going to be... Why am I having this?
Just use this microphone in your hand, please.
You want me to use this, not this?
Yes.
Very good.
Very good.
Do I need to turn the other one off?
No, you're fine.
Okay. All right. How's this?
That's better.
That's better? Okay. I can yell. I mean, I'm a post-secondary educator. I know how to do that.
That would not be.
All right, we're gonna do this again. So Anna Sophia and Ainsley and Andy are members of my team at CNIB who've worked on the project that we're going to chat with you about today. That being responsible conduct of research through an accessibility and inclusion lens. And their biographies are on the website for the conference, and I won't dwell on them. Bonnie is a close colleague of ours who is the director of the Center for Disability Health Equity at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and is part of this panel, and then you'll hear from Bonnie as part of the short talk right before the end. We're going to take the next apparently 61 minutes to have a conversation with you with respect to accessibility in the research space and accessibility in how research is done. I'm going to start a conversation today with you by saying something I think that's rather fundamental and important. We've heard this morning about a broken system. The system's not broken. The system is doing exactly what it is intended to do, and that is exclude those of us who are sitting up here and exclude those of us who were up here before from participation. I think that's a very uncomfortable thing for people to hear, and a very uncomfortable thing. Well, it's not uncomfortable for me to say it. I'm all about throwing down gauntlets, and so I've thrown my first. It will not be my last, right? But it's an uncomfortable thing to hear. And the reason it's an uncomfortable thing to hear is because if the system is working the way it's intended to, it means that everybody is complicit. And nobody has as yet tried to change it. So let's have a conversation about that for the next little while, okay? The next slide, which I have no ability to see because of how the comfort screen is located, actually identifies the members of the team who are up here, and as I said, that's Ainsley, Anna Sophia, Andy, and Bonnie, and myself. And what are our goals today? What do we want to accomplish this morning? First of all, we want to talk about and present the need for a national framework for the accessibility and inclusivity of research methods and practices within academic and community research settings. We want to identify potential best practices to be considered within this framework. We want to focus on establishing how the framework can lead to cultural and attitudinal change toward inclusive research methods. And we want to discuss how researchers ensure privacy and consent to participation within research is respected and considered throughout the research process and ethics. I'm going to start by throwing some numbers at you, which I think are really important to understand. Disability is not a niche conversation. In the 2016 census and the 2017 Canadian Survey on Disability, there were identified approximately 6.2 million individuals, 22.4% of the population aged 15 and over, who identified as living with one or more disabilities. The prevalence of disability in Canada increases with age, as you might expect it to do, ranging from 13% for those aged 15 to 24, up to 47% for those aged 75 and older. And so if you think about that, anybody who's doing gerontology-related research or geriatric-related research, half of your population are persons with disabilities. Women were more likely to have a disability compared to men, 24% compared to 20%. The other interesting thing to note is as of June 2023, Canada's population exceeded 40 million people. And so the numbers that I just prefaced this conversation with are 6 years out of date. And so 22% of 40 million people is 8.8 million, right? So it's no longer 6.2, it's now a much larger number than that. When we talk about human-centered research, I think it's really important to acknowledge that, frankly, most things is human-centered research, right? We can talk about human-centered research specifically in the context of healthcare, in the context of public health. I think all of us on the stage are in some way, shape, or form public health researchers. So we can talk about healthcare, we can talk about public health. There's a lot at this conference about artificial intelligence and the use of artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is developed and implemented is also human-centered research, right? We can talk about innovation in a variety of contexts, obviously innovation in the STEM space, innovation in healthcare. We can also talk about things like climate change, and we can talk about things like disaster prevention. We can talk about things like natural resources. You can go through a very long list, and there's a whole bunch of things that would be considered to be human-centered research questions. When we talk about disability in the context of human-centered research, we need to talk about who's participating. We need to talk about who's doing, and we need to talk about who and how the research is being governed. Today, a few examples of things that I think we all need to be aware of. There's limited representation and diversity in research samples that leads to biased results and limited generalizability. It happens more often than we think in a number of different ways. Exclusion of valuable perspectives and insights from researchers and individuals with disabilities, which will result in research that doesn't fully address our needs and experiences. We've got inadequate accessibility measures in research protocols, materials, and data collection methods. And so persons with disabilities, we're not able to participate in the research that is actually supposed to be about things that really involve us. There's a lack of consideration for accessibility and assistive technologies, which will hinder persons with disabilities from fully engaging within the research process, either as active researchers or as participants. And then there's also a failure to address specific challenges and barriers faced by individuals with disabilities, resulting in research findings that do not adequately inform inclusive policies and practices. So, what does the research process look like? What we're talking about today is the research process. So this is how we conceive it to be. We have a space within the research process, a domain for preliminary exploration, which talks about defining a research question, performing a literature review, identifying research resources needed, and that includes pulling your team together. Methodology design, defining your method, building your proposal, getting your ethics. Your research process itself, where you are conducting experiments, you're collecting data, you're analyzing the data, and then the sharing of the results, where you're going through the interpretation, you're writing up your findings, you're putting things through peer review, you're putting things out at conferences, you're putting things out back to the community. That's the research process. It is the entirety of that process that we're here to discuss and dissect with you in the next 54 minutes. So, Mentimeter is not accessible. Slido is not accessible. Poll Everywhere is not accessible. We're going to do this old school, which is frankly also not accessible, but more accessible than any of the above. That's the beauty of technology, isn't it? Technology doesn't make the world more accessible all the time. So every table should have a piece of paper. And on this piece of paper, the two questions that are on the slide in front of you. The first of which is, where do you believe the biggest gaps for accessibility and inclusivity are within the research process? And the second, how do you believe accessibility and inclusivity should be embedded within these areas? If you do not have this piece of paper, please raise your hand. And Austin down in front here will make sure you get a piece of paper. And then we're going to invite you to take 3 minutes to fill this out and give it back to us. And then we're going to start asking some questions of the group on the stage, and we're going to get this party started.
And feel free to discuss it with your tables.
Yes, it's not a do-yourself exam.
If there's any, yes. So ideally, if it can be done as a group, it would be fantastic. So yes, ideally there would be 1 or 2 pieces of paper per table, and if you can have a wonderful discussion, that's the best way of creating knowledge, co-creating knowledge. Accessibility does not happen in the vacuum.
We're going to go ahead and get started up here. We recognize we gave you 3 minutes to tackle both questions. We're not going to collect those sheets back until the end. And so feel free to jot some notes and put ideas down and ideate and brainstorm as we have a conversation with you based upon our conversation with you. And I think that would be a really effective way for you to think through what you want to do. And at the end, just make sure that you give your papers back to Austin so that we can collect them all, and that would be fantastic. So now it's time for panel participation side of things. And Ainsley, I'm going to ask you the first question. And the first question is this. So we've talked about what the landscape is today. So why do we think a national framework for accessibility and inclusivity in research is both necessary in the academic and community research setting, and why do we think it's going to make a difference?
Thank you, Mahadio. Excellent question. Is
just-
this on? Testing?
Yep, there you go.
Testing? Okay. Thank you, Mahadio. Great question. I'm so excited to be here today on this panel and to explain why I think we need a national strategy on research and why and the ways in which we can make it inclusive and accessible. As Mahadio alluded to earlier, the system is not broken. It's actually been built to exclude people who didn't build the system. And it does quite a great job of that. And so a lot of us just go through the system, and if you're not from an equity-deserving group or some lived experience that has given you some form of discrimination or experience of trauma, then you don't know what the points are in the system are that need changing unless somebody else tells you or you ask them about it. And that's hard work for them to do. And first of all, as the most recent panel alluded to, just talking about the issues doesn't actually do anything to change them. And so we need a way to illuminate where all the unconscious biases are in the system so that people can work towards changing them. And stop talking about where the barriers are, but actually have something that tells people, how they can make this a better system for everyone. So very briefly, and Mahadio also alluded to this, there are so many barriers in research for persons with lived experience from groups that have been traditionally excluded from this science ecosystem. And they are all over the place. So let me talk about the participant piece first. So dissemination is a big important piece of our research. We go through, we do important work, we generate knowledge, and we hopefully disseminate it to a wide audience, including policymakers and scientists and colleagues to build on that. What we know today in science would not be possible without all the shoulders of all the things that people before us have figured out. Except that, look at where we publish them. We publish them in academic journals, often that are behind paid firewalls. Sometimes they're available for public access, but they're often in PDF or other inaccessible formats to people who are using screen readers, screen magnifiers, and other forms of assistive technology. If you are waiting and constantly waiting for accessible formats of those things, your work is going to be delayed. And of course, when we measure productivity and the competitiveness of the system, it's very difficult to establish yourself as a science policymaker or a researcher. When we talk about public engagement, we often talk about Indigenous communities will often say, somebody came up to the Arctic to do some research, and they said they're going to do community engagement. And their form of doing community engagement is, here, you're a guard against polar bears, or you're a caribou guard, and you're keeping people safe. That is not public engagement. They might have a meeting, and the researchers come into the community and say, hey, we're going to have a meeting, this is what we're going to do. That is also not public engagement. That is communication. And so knowing the difference between public engagement and communication is really important. We can talk about research tools. Lots of softwares are not accessible to people who use assistive devices. If you are a student who's blind, good luck in your statistics and your mathematics courses. They're very difficult to do and a huge contributor to the leaky pipeline. but also how we treat the data. So people from equity-deserving groups, if they're participating in research that is specifically not about their equity group, often they might be an outlier in the data set. Is that just thrown out? So people need guidelines about what to do with the data around outliers, especially when those outliers are represented by equity groups. And when we are going to build a process to be more inclusive, we actually are really concerned with those outliers. That is what we should be concerned about. And so we need to be drawing people's attention to more inclusive data analysis methods and treatment of outlying data.
Thank you very much, Ainsley. So very much an approach of thinking differently, fundamentally differently about how we do science and how we do research. One more follow-up for you, Ainsley. Why now? Why 2023, 2024? Why is it important for this work to be done today?
So I think there's a lot of intellectual and creative capacity among people with disabilities and people with other lived experiences as well. And there's clearly no shortage of huge gargantuan problems that are facing humanity, including climate change, but also AI and things like that. If AI is not done properly, it's also going to be to the detriment of equity-deserving groups, including persons with disabilities. And I think other groups around the world, other countries have already acted on including people from diverse equity groups in research, including people with disabilities, but Canada is way behind.
Thank you, Ainsley. So my next question is for you, Bonnie, and you know I'm curious sort of about the international perspective in all of this, right? So how does the role of international policy really influence the imperative for a national framework on accessibility and inclusivity in research, and whether that national framework is a Canadian framework or an American framework? For me, for this conversation, it doesn't matter. Somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to be first. So how do we work within that international policy framework, do you think?
Yeah, well, first I'll say thank you. You know, I think I'm just grateful for this conversation and to be here. As someone not from Canada, I appreciate this conversation. And you're exactly right. There's not a framework, period. There's not an international framework for this work. There's not a framework for this in the United States. And I think increasingly, and I'm sure everyone in this room, in this space, understands that research doesn't stay within a country. Our research and our collaborations and the information and knowledge we generate goes, if we do a good job, around the world. It has global implications. And so we really do need to collaborate and develop this framework to respond to that, right? And as has been discussed, you know, considering that people with disabilities have been excluded from research historically and still remain, we really do need that roadmap, right? We need to think holistically about the ways in which we are including disabled people, participants in the research, the people doing the work, and addressing those structural barriers, which really we haven't. And you know, I just want to say that I think in this work, it's also important to understand there are still variations of places on these issues internationally. So the US is in one place. I think Canada we're in similar-ish places on these issues, but that's not the case everywhere, right? And there's lots of reasons why that is, but that impacts all of our work in so many ways. There's a critical shift in disability community, particularly in the US, and I know in Canada too, around how we view ourselves. And that has not been embraced in research, in healthcare, in many spaces. And that shift is really one from thinking about people with disabilities as an identity group, as a demographic. So some people will maybe call that a social model of disability, but it's even further. It's more than that. Disability has historically been framed as a health outcome, something to prevent, to treat, to cure, not as a group of people. And there's nuance here. We are a demographic as a disabled person. We are a group of people that face deep inequities, that science, technology, and research have a critical role to play. These are places and spaces where we're teaching the next generation about bodies, systems, language about disability, and it absolutely has to change in these areas, the ways in which we talk about disabled people, the ways in which we think about disability, and that really does have to be on a global scale. But the idea about accessibility, right, we face two barriers, ableism and lack of accessibility, and we've got to tackle both to have progress, right? And I think this work really is critical, and thinking about it very holistically and how we can work together in driving change across the research ecosystem.
So Bonnie, you mentioned ableism, and that's a word that I'm glad that somebody mentioned in this panel. I'm going to seize on that word for a moment, and we'll come back to this in the reflections. This is where I go off script, and Anna Sophia might actually, yell at me later because she wrote the script. And so ableism is a construct that I think we're this room, as representative of the STEM ecosystem and the research ecosystem in Canada, we might be great to talk about it theoretically. We're not great to talk about it practically. And so let's delve into that for a moment, and perhaps a bit of reflection from you, Bonnie, on how ableism does manifest. So Ainsley gave some really good examples of barriers, and I gave some really good scenarios of ways that persons with disabilities are excluded. Where does ableism fit into that?
Yeah, so ableism is, in general, the idea that people without disabilities are the ideal, right? And I know when I say that, there's always sort of a thought in some spaces, in most spaces actually, among many of us, because that is absolutely what we are taught. And we are taught that without hesitation. But what does that mean, and what are we losing, right? So how and where is ableism? It's absolutely everywhere. It is entrenched in our beliefs about disability. It's structural in our policies and procedures. It's institutionalized even in the ways in which we design things like conferences, which I'll talk a little bit about, and the ways in which we do science or don't do science. Ableism can be between individuals, right? It can be internalized. And all the ways that other sources of oppression can manifest. I think in research, though, it is a bit unique, because when we are thinking about research that involves patients, quote unquote, or populations that have diseases or impairments, there is a unique relationship with ableism and people with disabilities that we need to unpack and address a little bit. And that is where ableism tends to rear its head, right? And it gets to questions around who is the expert on disability? Who gets the final say? Is it disabled people? Is it people that have studied disability? Is it caregivers? Right? I mean, these are really questions that haven't been asked enough. And in science and research, those kinds of questions around expertise and who is the expert really remain. There's that hierarchical structure that I think all of these panels talked about. And for people with disabilities, we have been held out of the system of leadership positions. And so, as a result, these questions about disability and who is the expert has gone to people without lived experience, without question, without hesitation. And that's absolutely what has to change, and why I think a framework like this is so critical. But in addition to that, if we want to disrupt that structure, we can't just think about that ableism. We also have to think about accessibility, and that's also what's unique about people addressing these issues for people with disabilities. It's like, as some will describe, it's like trying to get into a secret club where you don't even have the code to the door, right? That's what inaccessibility is like. We don't have access to spaces, places, knowledge and information. We simply can't get access. And when we're talking about, and I've heard those words in this this morning of access and even accessibility. And it's, I don't know, what's that movie, Princess Bride? I don't think that word means what you think it means, or whatever that saying is. To us, that means something very specific. And when people are using those words, and I think that's part of what, I think a framework like this has to describe, or will describe, is what does that really mean?
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Anna Sophia, I'm going to jump to you for a moment, just because of some technical troubles I know we're trying to resolve. So intersectionality, right? How does intersectionality play a role in this conversation from a research methods and research process perspective, considering that disability itself is not a monolithic experience, and intersecting lived identities are not monolithic experiences. So what's the role of intersectionality in this proposed framework that we're working on?
Yes, so intersectionality has become a trendy term. How many of you have heard the term intersectionality before? Okay, a lot of folks.
Please don't bother showing your hands, by the way. Noise would be a little bit appreciated in addition to that. There you go. That's better.
Love it. So yeah, when it comes to intersectionality, this is a term that comes from critical race theory, and what it tells us is that based on our lived experiences and our identities, we experience oppression and privilege as such differently based on that. They intersect and they make us experience things differently. Now, this is very, very important when it comes to research, and when it comes to research specifically when we start thinking about disability, because oftentimes we tend to go into a cookie cutter label. This is what the identity is, and this is all what we research. I'll share this out of someone who has experienced the results of this. I identify as a Mexican woman with indigenous heritage from Mexico, Purepecha and Mazahua. I also have ADHD. And for me, I was diagnosed with ADHD in my university time. And it was something that there was a part of me that felt a bit upset about the fact that it took that long for me to get that diagnosis. And as I started looking more into it, it turns out that the reason why women were not getting diagnoses were just because they were not researched. So a lot of the research that happens when it comes to neurodivergence happens specifically in white boys. So we have a huge amount of folks that right now are getting diagnoses because before they were just not labeled as such, and that's problematic. So that's just one tiny example of what this happens. Now, when we talk about this is something that once we start bringing it back to research, when I chat with researchers, the common thing that I hear is that, well, but this is not part of my research. I'm just researching in this specific area, and that's all, like, this, I don't have to really care about this. And the reality is no. I have worked in equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility for probably about 8 years. Actually, I have to say that this first panel in 2016 was organized by Dr. Imogen Cohen and myself. For the first 3 years, had folks like Shahini and Mahadu at this panel. So it's fascinating to be so many years later still having these conversations. Yet it's a little bit disappointing how little far we've gone. So this is a call to action to all of you. But throughout this time, I went through my career being probably the most unemployed person ever to the most employed person ever from 2016 to 2020. So the pandemic hits, people are starting to lose their jobs. I'm like, people are not going to be racist online. People are racist online. And 2020 hits, a lot of things happen in 2020. How many of you, and I'm not asking to raise hands right now, I'm just asking you to reflect on this, posted a black square on Blackout Tuesday? How many of you promised that you were going to be learning about decolonization and you were going to be learning more about how we're going to fight racial inequity? How many of you were determined that you were going to be learning more about indigenous relations and understanding the importance of bringing indigenous ways of knowing into the sciences back in 2020, back in 2021? How many of you have implemented this into your research nowadays? How many of you have actually gone and looked into what decolonizing methodologies in research are? Very likely that very few, because I do research in this field and I have not found your papers. So if you have the papers, please send them to me. I'm very, very interested to see them. But the reality is that not a lot of people have been trying to understand what decolonizing methodologies can look like in the sciences. There's very, very little work done on this. And a lot of my work, and I'm a graduate student right now, also a professional consultant, is to try to understand what does research methodologies with an intersectional framework can look like, and whether or not folks who might not identify with certain identities can or cannot do that research. And there's actually a lot of really good literature that talks about what are the steps that folks like myself that might not have certain lived experiences can take towards understanding and doing due diligence as part of your research so that you're not implementing greater coloniality to the research process. So as part of that, if you're interested in learning some of those papers, I strongly recommend that you start connecting with social scientists, because a lot of us are really, really talking about the importance of positionality, understanding your positionality within your research and what your privilege and your experience is as part of that. Being humble as part of that and understanding that while some of us might be, well, not me, but some of you might be really, really fantastic and very, very fantastic scientists, you may have not done this work before, and that's okay for now, but not for the future. I hope that after today, you understand that it's no longer okay. You have learned this now, and I very gladly would share some papers with you. But as part of research methodologies, things that I really, really like to share with people and have them understand is understanding, for example, if you're working with Black folks, really understanding, and it was mentioned in previous panel, this term that is very, very important. I'm a social justice educator doing my master's at OAC, and one of the terms we really use is using culturally responsive education, culturally responsive research. What are you doing to actually understand that? When it comes to research, I know researchers in this table have done research where you incorporate things such as photo voice or oral history as part of connecting with communities where maybe the way that we have been collecting data has not been the safest and the most accessible to folks. When we talk about right now, as a consultant in this field, I get a lot of questions from clients on demographic data collection. And the first thing I ask people is, what do you know about Indigenous rights and Indigenous data ownership? Most people know nothing. Indigenous peoples have the right to own their data. So how are you ensuring that your data governance, when you're collecting this data, is actually taking into consideration the realities of the rights of Indigenous peoples, that self-determination that Indigenous peoples have the right to, they're rights holders on this. What are the things that you're doing to actually try to go, not just the checkbox, I need it for my NSERC grants, that's why I'm collecting this data, but actually to understand what's happening and do it in a respectful and safe way for everyone. How are you collecting disability data in a way that is actually representative of the community and not just legislation checkbox language? How are you actually connecting with the community as you're informing the ways that you're designing your research? And most of us don't really do that because it takes time, it takes effort, and we don't put it as part of our research methodology when we're asking for grants. So my encouragement to you is take a step back and assess that a little bit more. And if you don't know, folks like myself, I'm happy to share this information and data with you. I cannot go and say that everyone with lived experience will do that because you could be putting an extra tax and burden on them. But when people like myself open up to you to be like, yeah, contact me, take them up on that, right? Like, feel free to reach out and learn more about things and create a community of shared knowledge and co-creation of knowledge. So yeah, those are my 2 cents on that.
Your 2 cents on that actually also encompass the follow-up question that I was supposed to ask you. So I'm not going to ask you that follow-up question. Instead, I'm going to ask you a different follow-up question.
Yes.
So Bonnie talked about ableism, and Ainsley alluded to some of these pieces as well. The interesting thing about the construct of ableism, the interesting thing about the hierarchy of human ability is it's a very Western European Judeo-Christian model of the human body and the human mind and the human spirit. And so by itself, ableism is a colonial construct.
Yeah.
How do we decolonize it? And I'm going to ask you to give me that in 3 minutes.
I would say that we need a national table for conversations on this that involve the community so that we actually unpack this. I believe that I am not the one to say how we do this. I can do the literature review and check what literature is out there to come well informed to these conversations, but I do believe that we need to have these conversations in rooms like this with folks who have lived experience, who have expertise, who don't have a clue, and come with a very, very humble mindset to have the conversations, and also a well-informed mindset, because many times we show up to the conversations without having done any of the homework, and that's just rude in my personal opinion. So actually doing the homework before you come to the conversations and put it there. And right now you have in front of you this amazing piece of paper where we ask you some questions. The research that our team does is around this sort of work. So if you're interested in continuing the conversations, we're very, very happy to grab your email and connect with you in the future. So yeah, that's my response.
Thank you. So we're going to go to Andy online. Andy, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm very sorry, but I was unable to hear the everyone else's presentation. So I may be coming into it from a unique lens, because I won't be able to follow on from what was said, because I don't know what was said. So I apologize for that.
That's all right, my friend. We're going to ask you a question. And we're gonna come back a little bit to focusing on ethical considerations and research methods. So how can ethical considerations be integrated into the national framework that we're developing to ensure responsible and inclusive research practices?
Well, I think incorporating that portion of it is critical, and using tools to analyze the effectiveness of ethics tools and what needs to be put in place so that researchers with disabilities can enter the research cycle at the ethical stage. It really needs to begin with conversations about what tools can effectively be used, allowing individuals who have disabilities, who are researchers, to be fully able to participate in the ethical submission process, as well as putting a situation where the lived experience is shared in a safe space. So creating a safe space so that individuals with disabilities can raise concerns with the challenge of entering the ethical consideration space, as well as there needs to be a big step forward to eliminate barriers within that process so that a more representative wave of researchers can be present within the research space by having an inaccessible ethical process, as we are discovering in the preliminary analysis that we are completing, prevents skilled researchers from gaining opportunities and subsequently attracting grants and being lead researchers on projects. And then that ultimately leads to researchers with disabilities being denied opportunities.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm gonna take a moment before we ask the next reflection question of the group to back up and talk a little bit about some of the research pieces that have gone in this, and then Andy, I'm going to come back to you for a follow-up, and we'll do a reflection question of the group as a whole. And then if there's time, I'd actually like the group to have a bit of a free-for-all. Because I feel like there's enough energy up here that we can have a free-for-all, and we're going to do that for a few minutes if we can. So a couple of things. So Ainsley's led a literature review on accessibility and inclusion in research practices. There's been 2,000 papers culled for analysis so far. The first time we did a lit review on this subject, it wasn't as part of this project, it was part of something else I was involved in at Queen's University. We found not one single paper on accessibility in research. in a lit review that was conducted according to best practices. And I think the group's all taking bets on whether or not we're going to find anything with the 2,000 papers that we're currently filtering our way through, and Ainsley's bobbling her head back and forth, suggesting probably not. We've undertaken a review of the ethics frameworks of, Andy, I think it's somewhere between 36 and 40 different post-secondary institutions and research institutes in Canada. Does anyone think we came across a single ethics framework that was fully accessible and inclusive? Louder? No. There you go. And that would be the right answer, right? Anna Sophia is undertaking a Delphi method approach to evolving the recommendations from this project. Bonnie is a member of the International Advisory Committee for this project and a valued collaborator in this space. This project was actually funded by Accessibility Standards Canada because ASC has recognized that as it does accessibility research, as it funds accessibility research, we're running into a fundamental conceptual ableist space and a fundamental conceptual series of accessibility barriers where the researchers who are doing the work are not fundamentally equipped to successfully engage with persons with disabilities, either on the research team or through research governance or as research participants. And so this team got funded to help address that by the creation of a national framework. As you can imagine, there's not a whole lot out there that we can draw on as intentionally written about best practices. If anyone's written a paper, we haven't found it. If you have, please tell us, because it's not publicly available. And by the way, it probably won't be accessible.
Yep.
Right? There actually was a very interesting recursive publication written, I'd say about a year or so ago, Bonnie, I don't know if you saw it, where somebody actually looked at the accessibility of academic publications in peer-reviewed journals, and that paper, wonderful that it was actually published in inaccessible format in an inaccessible journal, right? That's ableism in research, ladies and gentlemen, and all others. So that's something that we need to be deconstructing. That's something we need to be unpacking. Andy, what strategies do you think researchers can employ to really ensure that privacy and consent and respect for persons with disabilities are really ensured throughout the research process? Andy, did you hear my question? Yeah? Andy is answering, but there's no sound. IT boys?
So there's a fantastic paper that Dr. Imogen Ko, Dr. Maharu Sukai, and myself authored a few years ago on how to host conferences a bit more accessible. It was probably the most dated paper because it was written prior to COVID and published right as COVID started, but now it's coming back in handy. So we strongly recommend you read it. It's in Facet's journal, so you want to host an accessible and inclusive conference. We're currently working on, and I'm going to be working with Ainsley on the next part of this, and with my lovely other researchers, the next part of that. So yeah, it would be lovely to hear your perspectives as well as to what are things that you believe as part of knowledge mobilization of research needs to change to make that process more accessible.
Okay, so while we wait for Andy to come back online, I'm going to ask a reflection question of the group here. And I'll ask you to answer this question in only about 2 minutes each. And then I think we'll have an opportunity for a bit of a free-for-all. How can the implementation of a national framework lead to cultural and attitudinal change within the research community? So we're going to create a framework. We're going to offer the framework through Accessibility Standards Canada and to the world. How will that lead to cultural change? What's our hope here? Ainsley, I'll ask you to go first.
So inclusion and equity work is really hard. And it should be hard. It's uncomfortable, and it should be uncomfortable. And I think one of the ways that this framework will lead to change is if people thoughtfully consider what's in this framework and compare it to what they already know and what they believe, and dig really deeply and question those beliefs, because people's beliefs and values about what they thought they understood about disability and ableism need to change. Accommodation processes are still legally sort of what we follow, but that doesn't mean that system is right, that it works. Frankly, no one who wrote that system ever had to use it. It's terrible. Accommodations don't work for employers, nor do they work for the people who have to request them. They are a floor and not a ceiling, but they're currently treated as a ceiling. And they do nothing to socialize people with disabilities as science researchers into the community and into academia. We need to be looking at universal design and applying it to human interactions, applying it to the research spaces we work in, applying it to research policies, and applying it to organizational policies as well. And frankly, the accommodation model is full of ableist ways of doing things, and so hopefully this framework can encourage people and to think about where they're coming from and where they might want to go to, and encourage them to change. And if it is uncomfortable to read, please just sit with that discomfort, because that's normal with inclusion and equity work, and it's necessary to move forward.
Thank you, Ainsley. Anna Sophia?
Yeah, I agree with everything Ainsley said, and it was actually in a talk not too long ago that I had with Dr. Imogen Ko, that she mentioned that in order to actually enact change, we need policy first. If we just leave it up to people and their good hearts, it's too much pressure put on individuals. And it's also not fair, because most of the times it ends up falling on people with lived experiences or people who actually care, who either have seen this through lived experiences or have put themselves the effort on doing this. And that's extra work, that's extra everything. And it continues to put the advocacy on the persons who are dealing with the lack of accessibility. For me, it's actually very, very interesting to see how that self-advocacy has such an effect in the extra burden on researchers, just from having to ask for accessibility, an accessible document for a grant application. The fact that that takes extra time for you to get back and forth, and then when it comes to submission time, there's still the rigidity of when you're to submit it versus someone who can just download it and start writing it right away. Like, those little things that we don't really think about, they compound as a whole. And unless we're putting an actual framework that people are following and they know and know how to take accountability of it, I don't think that we're going to be doing a good move forward. When it comes to things such as data collection and data ownership and best practices, right now there aren't really best practices out there here or a framework in Canada that can help people know how to collect this data in a way that is actually inclusive and actually mindful of the communities that is collecting this data. So for me, all of these things comes back to putting that framework. When I work with research institutes, one of the things that I keep also seeing is that research institutes that are not universities, but also universities, tend to follow the tri-agencies ethical processes and what the tri-agencies recommend. So we know that they're already following what the government's doing and saying. So if we know that this is working, I think that that's a great approach for us to continue right now and start really giving and prioritizing work on accessibility as one of the things that we need to really ensure people take accountability for.
Thank you, Anna Sophia. Bonnie?
Yeah, so our presence is still radical, right? Our just simply showing up, being here is radical. And it's so apparent, right? And I think to everything that was just described, as a researcher with a vision impairment, right, and the process of even just writing a grant, like we were describing, I mean, just for those who don't have that lived experience, the background research, the majority of research articles are not accessible. That's extra time or knowledge I can't put into the grant, making me less competitive for the funding. The portals for the grant submission, not accessible, extra time, extra assistance that others aren't taking. That's a ding to my process and productivity. The review portals to review publications or review grants, inaccessible. So I was I've only been a grant reviewer once in my life, actually, for a national grant cycle. And I know my name was under consideration at a federal agency, which I will not name, in the United States. But I was told that there was concern because of my vision impairment that I wouldn't be able to handle it, right? So, these are just some of the examples. And so what that leads to is that radical just presence leads to actually our exclusion, right? Or is a result of our exclusion. And that impacts, there's a bidirectional relationship with the work we do, the impact it can have, and it shrinks that impact. And so by having a roadmap to change that, I think is the only path forward, because it cannot be changed by disabled people. We are not in these spaces. And accessibility is not something that just disabled people can do. It requires everybody. It is everyone's responsibility. And so what I hope that the byproduct of something like this could be is to not only change the way we do science so that we can include more people from many more groups, drive innovation at a faster pace than we are now because of that, hopefully lead to a progress on how we view disabled people. But I also think it is an opportunity for more people to understand and learn about things like accessibility, because that's what it's going to take, right? And there's just not, as you were both saying, opportunities for that. And there needs to be this roadmap to break that, right? An associated policy to then drive that and to create an impetus for people to make change. So I do hope it makes this, us being here, less radical, but
A few more examples on top of what Bonnie's saying. How about the researcher whose assistive technology doesn't interact with SPSS, who spends 8 months fighting to get her assistive technology to interact with SPSS and living in fear that her boss will fire her because work's not getting done?
Yep.
That's actually one of my researchers on my staff at CNIB. How about the research project that focuses on assistive technology for aging adults that's put in an inaccessible survey platform to send to them? How about the recommendation for approval of a medical device in Canada that goes with the words, "This device is not safe for a person with vision loss to use," and those words are there because the supplemental methods of the paper upon which that recommendation was based said, we actually don't know how to code an accessible survey, so we didn't. True stories, ripped from the headlines that none of us ever read. Well, I mean, we read them. Hopefully you will start reading them, and you will start seeing them. Andy, do you have anything you would like to add to the question? We're still having audio issues. Looking at the folks in the IT booth at the back, although I can't see you. Hoping you'll give me a signal that I can interpret. Okay.
I think
so,
that's just no.
all right. So we've got a couple of minutes for the panel to have a free-for-all before I ask Bonnie to come forward and chat about the toolkit that actually talks about accessible conferences as well, which I'll introduce in a couple of minutes. So we've got 3 minutes for a free-for-all. Is there any comment from any of you? Ainsley.
Just a couple of things. So we've talked a lot about researchers with disabilities and the lack of them and all the things that come out that need to be changed to make that more inclusive. But when we talk about people with disabilities more generally and the decisions and the policies that are being planned and put into place with climate change and with all the things that are going to be coming with AI, if persons with disabilities and accessibility is not included in those things and ableism isn't highlighted, then persons with disabilities generally are going to face very significant barriers in the future because of the way that we're treating AI and we're leaving people with disabilities out of those processes, and similar with climate change. So the policies we're going to enact to help mitigate climate change will actually harm persons with disabilities, again, because we're not at the table.
Thank you, Ainsley. Bonnie or Anna Sophia? Anything?
I can say my last radical thing, which is that I think that we need to challenge the elitism that exists in science methodology, because I truly believe that one of the biggest challenges I have, especially working in fields. I was a trained physicist originally, transitioned into social justice work. The reality is that many times we see work such as social sciences or work where we start incorporating indigenous ways of knowing and incorporating Black knowledge and systems as part of research. We start thinking of them as second in line, as not as prestigious enough or not as scientific enough. And to me, that's very problematic because we are really, really, really creating a very one-way, one-size, one-designed way of doing science. And I think that we need to start challenge that a little bit more so that we can actually incorporate indigenous ways of knowing, incorporate really persons with disabilities as part of conversations, incorporating people who have all of those identities intersected as part of such. So yeah, I think that in my personal perspective, we should start challenging a little bit more our methodologies and thinking whether they're actually as excellent as we think they are.
Thank you, Ana Sofia. Andy, I understand that we can hear you now. The message on the screen that said so was not readable, but thank you very much. Andy, any comments or last words?
I'd like to reiterate what Ana Sofia and Bonnie said about the competitive disadvantage that researchers with disabilities are placed under by all the barriers that I only heard a few of the presentation, and the only way we can really alleviate a lot of those barriers is through policy formation of best practices and implementing those so that some of these barriers that have been mentioned throughout the presentation become less severe or are eliminated totally. Some of the things that you had mentioned earlier about, not having access to SPSS, but it's also education into accessible competencies for individuals so that some of these inadvertent mistakes can be alleviated.
Thank you, Andy. Bonnie, the last word goes to you before I wrap this and introduce you.
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand this is not just a disability issue, right? That including people with disabilities as researchers and in our studies is an issue for all of us. It really will improve the pace of science and has implications for all of the work we're doing. So in disability justice work, we talk about all issues as being disability issues. And I certainly do hope people will embrace that. And I think that it's a moment to get a little radical, right? As Judy Heumann, the late great Judy Heumann, who I had the privilege of knowing, would say, to get feisty and to think about ways in which, as researchers, which I think sometimes we don't always want to be activists and advocates, it's time we do that on this issue. And that's a call to action to everybody, right? Not just our colleagues with disabilities.
I think, yeah, that deserves it. Yeah, there's the applause. Thank you. I will say this. I've been an accessibility professional for 20 years, and it's not because I was trained to be one. It's because in order to finish my PhD and do my postdocs and have a scientific career, I had to be one. And I don't want to be known as an accessibility professional. I want to be known as a scientist because it's what I am, it's what I've done, and it's what I'm damn good at. Yeah. As everybody here on the stage. Right? Scientist first, accessibility professional second. So, I will conclude by saying thank you very much for listening to this panel. We hope we've shaken you. Hopefully that doesn't mean that you're going to go back and say, never invite them back. Next year at this time, I'd like for us, the same group, to be on the same stage, perhaps even in a plenary session, unveiling these national guidelines, as opposed to talking about them in an EDI symposium.
Yes.
I think we'd all come back for that.
100%.
So let's work toward that. The guidelines are going to be done by spring. They'll be out into the community by summer. A number of you, based on your interactions with Austin and Anna Sophia and Ainsley and myself, who are here throughout the conference, hopefully will join some of the research efforts that we're going to be doing. If you're interested, come and speak to us. Thank you very much for the opportunity to the conference organizers to be up here. I get the pleasure of introducing Bonnie, who has been a really, really good colleague and friend over the past few years. We met just before the pandemic, and this is probably only like the third time we've been in person together. Bonnie and I co-founded an organization called the International Network of Researchers with Visual Impairments and Their Allies, abbreviated INOVA. We kind of squashed all the words in there to get to the abbreviation. And one of the things that INOVA did over the past 2 years was sort of in parallel with and orthogonal to the paper that Anna Sophia mentioned, actually thought about conference accessibility through the lens of sensory disabilities. Marianne and Melanie, when you were up here as moderators, and by the way, all the moderators today, their first name started with the letter M, which was kind of interesting. But Marianne and Melanie, when you were up here, how situationally blind did you feel with the spotlights? Honest question. Right? A bit? Okay. Right? I can't see anything past the podium. And that's partially because I have low vision, but also partially because the lights are blinding. And so when we talk about disability, we talk about permanent disabilities, temporary disabilities. This is a situational disability for anybody who is standing right here. Right? So I'm going to invite Bonnie up to talk about a conference accessibility toolkit that INOVA developed, and we've since had translated into I don't know how many languages, but I won't steal Bonnie's thunder. I'll invite her to the stage and have her tell us about it.
All right.
Woo!
Thank you.